Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Courtland Sykes coming from Southwest Missouri, and you're listening to The Break It Down Show.
And now, The Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yeah, this is a really interesting show. So today's show that went up is Tito Ortiz, UFC champion, Hall of Famer, and he's a fighter. We also have two other fighters that I'm recording shows with today, and I also have a very special co-host today. So I've got a little bit of talking to do here for a second. But Courtland Sykes is a guy who's he's worked with the teams. That means he's worked with SEALs. He's an intel collector, so this is technically a spy versus spy episode, which is always cool because dudes who go out and collect, we see the world in a different way, and so I can't wait to get into that stuff. And joining me today is someone I knew, gosh, Eric, almost 30 years ago now. I mean, before we know it, it will be 30 years. Yeah, Eric and I were counterintelligence agents in Germany, and we both deployed to Bosnia, and so it's neat to be able to bring like-minded folks. And I knew that when we were going to have Courtland on because of his background, it helps to have another intel guy on because we get this stuff better than anybody else gets it. So Courtland, welcome, and thank you for coming on the show. Eric, thank you for co-hosting with me. I'm super stoked that we got this done. And fellas, let's just get started. Courtland, will you kind of give us a background with your experience with the teams? Give us an idea of what you did as just an analyst and a collector.
Sure, Pete, and thank you for having me on, Eric and Pete. So my service to this country began just after the attacks in 9/11. I was down in school in Florida, and I finished out that semester, and I joined the Navy, intending to go on and go to BUD/S and become a Navy SEAL. And I ended up being selected for the Naval Intelligence Program, went to BUD/S. I only lasted 3 out of the 6-month program, so I didn't make it. But I think I caught a couple people's, I caught their eye and I got their attention. And they ultimately placed me on SEAL Team 5, where I deployed as an intelligence analyst with those guys. And then Unit 3 out of Bahrain. And then ultimately I was selected for the Defense Intelligence Agency to work out of their attaché program. This is where I spent a year in DC, of course, doing the training and the tradecraft and the language. And then I went to Latin America, and that was the bulk of my intelligence collection experience, where we would run overt, covert, and clandestine, operations, or assist in clandestine operations, and work with a lot of law enforcement in the area down there.
So in terms of your collection and tradecraft stuff, Eric, let me know what you think before we even get to Courtland. I've always found that the tradecraft training is challenging because you have to do it in real time. The folks that do it know the area hyper well. Like if you've ever done tradecraft training in DC, your instructor is able to run circles around you because this is for the audience now. When you're doing surveillance in Washington, D.C., it seems like every road has 5 names. So if you have a navigation system that talks to you, it will say, you are on the George Washington Pikeway, State Route 22, Interstate 95. It's just like it keeps going and going and going. So the tradecraft thing, I want you to talk a little bit about your experience with that. Eric, you've done tradecraft training. What are your thoughts on that before we get into it?
One of the things that always bothered me about my tradecraft training was it was always during the middle of the day, which no normal people were out and about, and we were kind of the odd ducks out regardless. So it was doubly challenging in order to practice the skills, because going to like the Maryland Mall at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, you're the only guy there, So
I saw you standing by that pillar. That's because I was standing by a pillar.
Exactly.
Courtland, go ahead and go.
So this is actually, I'm glad you brought that up, Eric, because this is for the audience in this one regard. If you happen to be in Washington, D.C. in the middle of the day and you have some downtime and you're going and seeing the sites, you can stop by, the Pentagon City Mall or downtown Alexandria. And if you happen to see any guys with, military style haircuts, or maybe some guys that are trying to grow their beards out,
you know what they're doing.
Yeah, just go up to them and say, hey, can you take my picture? Go ahead and interact with them. And that way it might make it a little bit easier for them, but you'll actually get a chance to see real tradecraft being practiced, or at least, that foundational experience. But for me, it was really good. What I really enjoyed about it was when they put these guys on you, it conditions the operators. And it's so necessary because when you're actually out there in the real world, this stuff will make you nervous. You have a lot of pressure on you. You have to do a good job. It's a matter of national security. So what I really appreciated about the immersion of the tradecraft training was the fact that, okay, we're going to do this a lot and you're going to get used to it. You're going to get used to being followed. And ultimately, it's just going to become like a second nature to you. So it is vitally important. But if you happen to see anybody out there sort of awkwardly standing in a corner, wide-eyed and not really having a lot of experience, don't be afraid to go up there and just say, pat them on the butt and tell them they're doing a good job, bravo Zulu, and job well done.
I mean, I probably wouldn't touch them on the butt, but you could always, give them a fist pump.
Fair enough.
Yeah, it's 100% true. Like guys that look like they should be in uniform because they've all gotten their hair cut before they've come out and they're not on relaxed grooming standards, so they haven't had a chance to grow a good beard.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Old Town Alexandria every day. Every single day.
That's it. that was my proving ground. That's where I started day one, week one. So
if you see like 7 cars in a parking lot by themselves all bunched together, you're like, yeah, those guys are doing surveillance training.
Well, I remember doing vehicle surveillance in Sierra Vista, and it's like there's only one road in and one road out of the town.
Yes.
It's like, come on.
Yeah. And then we ended up at the Tucson Mall, Eric, right? Okay, so this is also
like every time.
Yeah, this is also for the audience, and this is not classified, though it is kind of sensitive. When we're doing surveillance, we talk in a code. And so the code is sensible words that are said, but they don't mean any sense if you hear it out loud. And I'm going to give you an example. I will say, Rabbit Leg Road Star. And that will tell everybody on the team some kind of thing. Here's the thing. Here's the problem with this, right? When you're in the Tucson Mall and you say Rabbit Leg Star and Road, everybody looks at you like you're a fucking freak.
Right.
So it's so funny. Like we get all bent out of shape and it's just, I don't know. All of the tradecraft stuff is absolutely important. And it does teach you to be hyper aware of things. But at some point, and this is kind of the direction I went, fellas, was I'm like, look, if I'm in fill in the blank country, Egypt, and I'm actually following somebody or I'm collecting, I'm better off just saying, yes, you think I'm a spy? Yes, I'm a spy. I'm here to find things out. And just be honest with it, because they all think you are already anyhow. And I don't know if you guys took that tack, but I certainly did.
No, I never took that tack. That's funny. I have one real quick anecdote I'd like to share about mall situation in downtown San Diego, if I may.
Please.
Sure.
Real quick. So we were doing surveillance out there. This was a 3912. This was with the Navy Special Warfare intel class. And this was before my DIA experience. But we were doing surveillance at the mall in San Diego. And I had a guy on my tail and knew he was there. So I went into the Abercrombie store, which is right there in the basement, or it was at the time. I don't know where it is now. And I needed to ditch this guy. I needed to get rid of him. So I just walked right to the back of the store. I asked for the manager. And I said, hey, there's this guy. He's been following me around. And I kind of described what he was wearing. He just seems a little out of place and a little bit odd to me. And if you don't mind, I don't really feel safe going back out. Oh, we're going to call mall security immediately. So mall security comes down and the guy was in the store. And as the mall security surrounded him, I just walked out and they stopped him. And it was I think I may have lost a friendship for a brief period of time there, but he understood. I think that was, so if you're ever in a situation, just don't ever be afraid to call the mall cops.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And I've actually screamed, help, he's trying to rape me, in very large crowds. And it's amazing how quickly you lose them.
Yeah. And I guess I should tell my little story. So Old Town Alexandria, and we're getting to the completion of the whole exercise. And we know we're at the end of the day. So we're nearly done. And we're on the rabbit. We're following this person, and this is all practice, by the way, everybody. So no one's got to get freaked out by clearance stuff. Anyhow, so we're following the person, and I'm about to take the point. Like I know that I'm next if most scenarios happen. And so sure enough, the scenario happens, and I'm on it, and the guy's going to get into a cab. And so I'm like, okay. And it started raining, so I'd gone into Walgreens to buy a poncho. So I've got a poncho on and everything. And I see him get in the cab, so I hop in the cab behind him, and I get to say, follow that cab.
Oh,
Yes.
classic.
And I had to cover it though, right? So I couldn't just say that. I had to say, I came up with this quick cover story saying, I think this guy's cheating with my girlfriend. I want to see what's happening and where he's going. And then as I'm saying this out loud to the cab in real time, in my little sneaky ear radio thing, they come in and they say, end exercise, index. So that means, okay, we're done. And so now I'm in this cab and we've pulled out and I'm like, you know what, to the cab driver, you know what? I don't need to do this. This is crazy.
Yeah.
I'm nuts. Just pull over and let me out. And the guy's like, yes, sir. Yes, sir. This is the good way. This is the good way. You cannot go down this road. So I gave myself an A.
Oh, man.
Oh, shit. Okay, so let me get back on track here because we could do that all day. We probably should, but
It might be more entertaining for your listeners. I don't know, but yeah.
yeah. You said an important thing when you were talking about you went to Buds and you didn't quite make it through. And everybody should understand that is not a failure. Like getting through Buds, you have to be healthy enough. Our friend who's going to be on the show next, I'm going to record with him in a little bit here, Bill, was walking around on a broken foot and leg. I mean, like just refusing to quit. So, and still didn't make it through. It's not about that. But you can prove yourself to the community and get out there and get through where they see value in you. And if they do that, it really is, to me, an operator who goes out and collects is an operator, whether you're a SEAL or anything else. So talk about what it was like to work with those guys, because they are the alpha of the alphas. And anybody they don't want there is not there. So you earned that spot and you kept it. Talk about that.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Bill. And incidentally, I don't know if you know this, Bill was my roommate at Buds.
That's what he said, yeah.
Yeah. And so I've got some funny stories about Bill, and I don't know if he would mind if I shared them with you. But, as it relates to your question, these are very diligent, hardworking, and a lot of guys, on the surface, it looks like they're just a bunch of, ground pounding, these guys are tough guys, tatted up, and they just care about guns and gasoline. These are very intelligent people. My Buds class was made up of, the enlisted side was comprised of mostly college graduates. Bill had a master's degree when he went into Buds, and he came in as an enlisted guy. So these are very intelligent people. They know exactly what they're doing. They know exactly what they're there for, and they're very professional. And they take everything they do very seriously, which is what was such a pleasure in working with these guys. And, of course, I maintain those relationships to this day. But don't just, when you look at these guys, they can drink beer and they can shoot guns and they drive, Harley Davidsons. But if you really wanted to have a philosophical conversation, it's really surprising, I think, to most people that they'll find a lot of intellectual powerhouses in those teams.
Well, when you're dealing with the special operation, command as a whole, you can't be anything less than near genius because of your roles and responsibilities, which we expect you to do on behalf of our country. So that doesn't surprise me one iota.
Well, Eric, don't butter them up too much. These guys have big egos, so let's be careful not to.
Well, but we also, and some of it is they should, because we send them into a place with very little backup, and we expect them to do wonderful and great things, so. And to also learn all the technology and the equipment and the skills required just to get there, so.
I think that if you were even in a position where you were looking for a positive mentor, the teams is a fabulous place to look and develop those relationships. And as they develop, these guys are very disciplined. They're very organized. And you're right. They're incredibly smart.
I mean, sometimes they can lack certain judgment, just like everyone else in the world, but they're not idiots by any stretch of the imagination.
Sure.
One of the things, too, that I've noticed from working with teams and special operators is you have to establish a bona fides, right? And even if there's I often stayed in a U unit would rotate in, and so they'd want to have like a murder board. What do you know about source operations or whatever it is? Did you have to go through any of that, like revalidation and providing a bona fides, or were you pretty stationary with one team?
I was stationary with one team for a while, but even getting into that team, of course, they wanted to know what you had to offer right away. I remember one of the team guys who I had gone through intel school with previously. We'd both gone to Buds together. He made it. I didn't. And when I was placed on his team as an intel guy, he knew me and he knew my work ethic, and he knew that I had that mindset. Nobody was going to outwork me. But he still wanted to evaluate me in front of the team, put me right on the spot. And that was a good thing. I think he probably did that more for me than anything, just to let him know, hey, look, we do have some squared away folks coming on board. And I actually appreciated the fact that he put me on the spot like that. But these are their lives we're talking about here. They take it very seriously. And frankly, when you develop the kind of relationship that they develop amongst each other, it's difficult for them to take outside advice even, or when they're bringing somebody on board, they want to make sure that you're as serious about the mission as they are. And that's important.
All right, Courtland, that is a very important thing. It's not just making sure that you have the skills necessary, but that you have that shared goal, that shared purpose, and that you are as fully invested in it as they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, many times you'll see, it's easy for people to come on board and they'll put you on the back burner. They're not going to, unless you have something to offer on a daily basis. And it's not like, hey, Courtland, he did this, he built this great package, or he's built this great product. And so my name is gold for the rest of the deployment. No, it is a daily process. It sounds like I'm trying to say you have to prove yourself every day. That's exactly what I'm saying. But you have to prove yourself, but they're proving themselves on a daily basis as well.
So when you do this and you prove yourself and you establish your bona fides, it's one thing to be like, yeah, you're in the club and everything, but at some point you're having to contribute something. Give us an idea what those things were, like that helped you to, like, I'll give you an example. I did a murder board with a bunch of guys that had no connection to me at all, none. Mm-hmm. And they're like, all right, give us a impromptu brief on this topic in source operations. And so I took about 5-10 minutes. I gave it to them. Nobody said a word because there was nothing to say. They're like, good enough. But then I also had to back that up later on and bring people in like, how the fuck did you meet this guy? And that kind of thing. Right. So what are those kind of things that you did with them that enabled you to go, I really can play at this level? And they already were good with that.
Okay. Well, early on, this was during the certification exercise before the deployment. We were at the CertX, and I just dove in and I think this is what probably caught their attention early on, to answer your question. This was in 2005, before the surge and before the tribal engagement. And I took these reports that I had independently researched and looked up to a lieutenant at the time, Colin Subco. Actually, he's the commander of SEAL Team 17 currently over in California. But he was a lieutenant at the time. And I said, look, I've got this idea. What about building these packages on these tribal leaders and engaging with these tribal leaders? And I'm not saying that I'm responsible for that. I was inspired to do that because I was an analyst. I was collecting the information. I said, okay, I think this is the direction that the team wants to go. And as a result, SEAL Team 5 became the figurehead. We spearheaded the entire Al Anbar tribal engagement program, which, again, there was a different group on SEAL Team 5 that I'm not going to mention, but they were responsible for all of those packages. But I think that that's what caught their eye, that I was the initial person in the intel camp that came up to them. And as a result, and this is where doing a good job will get you into trouble, I ended up becoming responsible for the daily briefs to the commander, who was Lieutenant Commander Ryan Patrick Shannon at the time. I haven't kept in touch with Commander Shannon, but it was actually, I took a great deal of pleasure into the fact that, they trusted me enough to go up there, and I briefed them on a daily basis on the days that I was in the FOB, I guess, because there were sometimes I would go out with the guys, but, for when I was in the camp, that became my responsibility.
All right. So Courtland, I've got a question for you. About your experience with the SEAL teams and the training and the shared experiences that you've had. How did this prepare you or not prepare you for, going into politics?
Well,
I'm just going to go right in there.
Yeah, good. And I'm glad, happy to answer that. I've given that a lot of thought. In the intel community or in the military, for example, we're all rewarded based on our virtue, based on our hard work, based on our honesty, based on our integrity. All of these things is what allows us, that's what promotes us in the intelligence community or in the military. And in politics, I happen to think it's just the opposite. You have to have a lack of integrity and honesty and a lack of virtue in order to climb. You have to be willing to compromise yourself in order to achieve that next level, in my experience and what I've seen so far. And I think a lot of people that have made that transition from the military into politics would agree with that. I mean, you have amazing veterans right now serving in Congress who probably agree with that.
Now, you touched on something. You said compromise your virtue and all that. Now, just thinking about our country as 54 states and territories, close to 400 million people, don't you think a certain amount of compromise is required for all these diverse backgrounds?
Yeah, I'm not talking about passing a bill or saying, hey, this is what's good for your community. Let's go ahead and get this through. I mean, there are many things stuck in these bills, obviously, that the different parties are going to disagree with. And I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, in terms of one of the biggest issues I believe there are in politics today is money. And so to say, okay, I truly believe in the Second Amendment and I believe it should be unrestricted. But in order to get this PAC to fund my campaign, I'm going to go ahead and say whatever I need to say. You're seeing a lot of this, obviously, in Washington. And that's kind of what I mean by that. Absolutely. Look, the United States is a large multicultural region. And when you've been given the responsibility of representing your community in Washington, D.C., whether it's your community or your state or your district, if you're in the Congress or your House of Representatives, you have to be willing to acknowledge the fact that, okay, my district in Missouri is going to be much different than what you see in California. But at the same time, we've got to pass a bill that represents the entire multicultural region. And I think that that's what you're talking about in terms of compromise. And that I could get there with, and it's all circumstantial, of course. I'm not saying I would agree. It depends on the bill. But you do have to have a sense of teamwork on the Hill. I understand that completely, to answer your question.
Okay. Yeah. I wasn't talking about personal value compromise, but it's more along the bigger picture, if you will, of, it's a team effort and we're not all the same.
Well, that's another thing that we're missing in Washington is the team effort. I mean, we have a lot of individuals who are representing us, unfortunately. So
one of the things when you get involved in a race, and I guess we should back up a little bit and say that you ran unsuccessfully for senator, but to get involved in the race, someone in your life says, Courtland, you're the kind of guy that we need. You're trustworthy, you're honest, you've served our nation. I would love to see you try and go for it. But to gather the tens of thousands of people that have to say yes to you is a big thing. How well connected were you before you started this in your state? And what was, like, realistically, when you look back on it now, was it a big leap to jump into the big leagues like that?
Well, it was, and I'll explain why I got in. But to answer your question, yes, my experience with the state of Missouri was very shallow when I entered. I had chosen to move to Missouri in 2015. And I grew up, just for full disclosure, I was born and raised in Arkansas, a state that I dearly love to this day. But, as a child, we would come up here. Every 4th of July, we spent up here in Table Rock Lake in southwest Missouri. And in my mind, this is the best kept secret in the United States. I love it up here. So, when I decided, after serving in the military, serving in the intelligence community, serving in the diplomatic community, I went to school. I could go anywhere in the world I wanted. And this is where I wanted to go. I wanted to come back here. And so that's what I did. The reason I jumped into this race without having a lot of exposure to my base was because I saw what was happening in Washington, D.C. Now, I'll back up. I was selected in 2016 to be on Donald Trump's National Security Council. And so this was before the election took place. And I was placed there by a man named Matthew Friedman. And Matthew Friedman was at the Defense Intelligence Agency at the time, had a really good relationship, obviously, with General Michael Flynn. And so he put me on the National Security Council with him to work with him in the White House. And at the time, not very many people thought that Trump was going to be able to succeed. They thought that he was going to lose to Hillary. And so nobody really paid much attention to it, I guess, at first. And once that election night came, I called up Matthew Friedman right away. I said, right when North Carolina turned red, I called up Matthew and I said, hey, look, man, I think we're going to win this thing. And he said, yeah, I know. I'm on my way to Trump Tower right now. So he went to Trump Tower. And as you guys probably know, the night of the election, the CIA has a safe that they deliver to the president-elect. So the CIA safe was on its way to New York. And if Hillary had won, they were going to turn left and take it over to Hillary's house. And if Trump had won, they were going to turn right and go down into Manhattan and deliver it to the Trump Tower. Well, Trump won, and Matthew Friedman was the only one who had a TSSCI clearance on the staff, an active one.
Right.
So he was the only one that could receive that safe. And of course, President Trump received his clearance right away. And so they were the only two allowed in that room at the time. And so it's kind of a funny story. Of course, I'm telling you what Matthew told me, but ultimately what happened was a lot of politics were at play. There was a lot of knife fighting going on in Trump Tower after the election. We know that Chris Christie was the chairman of the transition team, and of course he was fired 3 days after the election, and so it was really a volatile experience. And Matthew said, look, you guys, you have all the resources you need. We've set you up. And, if you don't want me here, I'm going to go ahead and leave. And with him, I left as well. So I ended up not being in the White House right now because of it. But I was on the backside of that. And I could have either done one of two things. I could have cried about it, or I could have done something about it. And the best solution in my mind was take my experience back home with me and do something that I thought would be effective, a positive influence for the country. And that was the catalyst, for me deciding to run was, okay, look, if I'm not going to get to serve on the National Security Council, I'm going to go ahead and run for Senate. And the reason I ran for Senate was because Claire McCaskill at the time was, the weakest candidate in the United States. And so I took a look at my experience. I had a couple of people take a look at it, and they said, yeah, this makes sense. You can run, you might be able to raise some money and win this thing. Then it's just the wheels started falling off pretty soon after.
Now, when you say the wheels fell off, what kind of issues occurred or plagued you, or?
Well, there was another good candidate. He was the current Attorney General, Josh Hawley, who incidentally is the current U.S. Senator for Missouri, and he's done a good job. In fact, there's nothing that Josh has voted for that I wouldn't have voted for. He's voted the exact same way that I would have. And I think he's he's a young guy, but he's very talented. He's very smart. And I think he's going to do a very good job of representing Missouri. So I'm cheering him on. But he was the big money candidate. That was number one. When we started reaching out to donors, we were not making that happen. It wasn't happening for us. So like anything else, in the community is a reflection of this. You just don't stop. You don't give up. I believed in my message. I believed that I had the right experience. And so I continued.
Okay. So it was more along the lines of, again, you had mentioned about the compromising on if you wanted to go after some of the money, would you have had to say things that you didn't necessarily agree with on a personal level, or, the seedier side of politics?
Okay, so I never had those deep conversations. Maybe the door was open, but maybe I didn't step through it. So though everybody understands that you have to raise money in a political campaign, at the same time, I was very guarded in terms of the money that I was willing to take. Because if I'm going to be representing the people, as a senator, you'd be representing the state. I wanted to represent the state. I didn't want to represent special interests. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Oh, it certainly does. Are you planning on continuing down the political path?
I really haven't given it much thought, frankly. I think that there's a lot that can be done in Washington. I think that you do have some really good players in Congress, both the Senate and House of Representatives. And if I felt compelled or inspired to run again, and if I was placed in the same situation, then yes. But right now, I'm more focused on, building a family and private enterprise.
Gotcha. Yeah, I know I've been out of the military now for about 100 days. And one of the biggest differences that I've noticed in the workforce is that shared goal, shared mission that I had in the military, and I'm kind of looking for it on the outside. So have you been able to make a smooth transition to the civilian world with that regard, especially coming from the team's background?
Well, that's interesting. And it's interesting because we have a tendency to stick together in the civilian side too. So we're always drawn to each other. And I'm always drawn to veterans, not just military veterans, but, former members of the CIA and things like that. So I'll say this, I'm happy to develop a professional relationship with anybody. But when I do see that somebody has put on a uniform, or perhaps they've served in the intelligence community or the diplomatic community, there's obviously right away there's a stronger bond.
I want to ask you a little bit about that too, because one of the things that folks that choose to serve seem to have a different look at, we're less worried about party, I'll say. And I'm struggling to find words because I'm trying to be careful with what I say. And there seems to be externally a desire, a balance between not right and left, but the greatest good for the greatest number of people versus helping those that can't help themselves or that are downtrodden by the machine or whatever. And so when Donald Trump gets elected, a lot of my friends, my challenge to them is if your president asks you and says, I need your help, would you do it? And a large majority of them say, absolutely not. I would never do that. And it blows me away. I've started to understand it recently, but it's a real challenge for me to hear that attitude where if the leader, the person with the hardest job, needs your help, not that Donald Trump would actually call you, but if he did, you would say no. I don't know, maybe we just look at service differently, but how do you deal with that? Like, let's say you get elected and, the next boss is, I don't know, someone that you don't back up. Are you able to get on board with what they're trying to do, or do you default to the downtrodden, or how do you sort through that stuff? Because that's a hard question, Courtland.
It is, and it takes a lot of maturity. Let's take a look, for example, John Kelly, the former chief of staff to President Trump. And he was recently asked this question, and he said he would absolutely have served Hillary because he would have worked for Hillary because it's about the greater good. It's about the country. It's not about political party or personality conflicts. It's about what can I offer that is the best for this country. I respect John Kelly for saying that he would work for Hillary. I'm not saying that I would have, but the fact that should be sort of a model in seeing the bigger picture and saying, hey, I'm going to give it everything I've got in service to this country. Actually, since you brought that up, one of the best reflections I've seen of one individual pouring out his intellect and his heart for the country, not a political party, is Michael Sawyer. He's probably a more controversial figure than I am, even because of the way the media has painted him and his statements. But this is a guy he's unafraid. And if you Google him, Michael Sawyer, you'll see that he's been in congressional hearings where he'll cuss out a Republican and a Democrat, congressman, because they have a political agenda. They have an agenda that they're trying to reach. And his only agenda is the preservation of the United States of America. So I see Michael as a very good reflection of exactly what you just described.
This episode of the Break It Down Show is brought to you by Lions Rock Productions.
That's us.
We publish, evaluate, and develop podcasts just like this one, consult others to build their own, and create associated content and content marketing strategies.
So if you're launching or expanding your social media presence, your business or your personal brand, or if you just want to take your media presence to the next level,
reach out to us on Twitter
at Pete A. Turner
or at JohnLG69.
at the Break It Down Show.
There's 1,000 ways to get a hold of us.
Now enjoy the show.
I see Michael as a very good reflection of exactly what you just described.
And I'd like to get into a little bit of this stuff. It's easier to run afoul of the press or somebody, or they use elements of what you say or believe against you. And these things, they're the essence of who you are, but they're misrepresented. I know this has happened because I've read the news about you and everything, but talk a little bit about how you do deal with that, where sometimes it's petty and you want to ignore it. Other times it just needs addressing. But let's talk a little bit about your thoughts on feminism or any of the other things that kind of probably challenged your ability to speak clearly and from the heart.
Right. I would say the biggest landmine that my campaign hit was when I spoke out against radical feminism, and it's a view that I maintain to this day. And if you put it in the context of what was developing at the time I said it, I was being interviewed. We had these rallies that were being held in Washington, D.C. and New York, where there were these disgusting women, in my view, this is opinion, of course, running around topless and wearing these pink hats and body paint on them, And I said, look, we've got a real problem in this country. And I was asked about how do I feel about women's rights. And I feel there is no difference between men and women's rights. We have very good laws, that were established even in 1977 to make it illegal for employers to discriminate based on gender. But my key takeaway was, if you're going to focus on success and equality, then gender has no room for that conversation. Because there have been very successful men and women in every field I'm sure that we've all worked in, the three of us. So there is no women's rights, there's no men's rights. And so then I targeted radical feminists, and I said, yeah, we've got a lot of nail-biting, manophobic she-devils out there. And it got a lot of attention. And I think the key takeaway for your listeners, if they are, if this matters to them, is that equality and success have absolutely nothing to do with gender. And they wanted to make my campaign all about gender. And it really was a pretty devastating blow, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And sometimes I think we have a problem with the words you use, like the she-devils and those, where I'm not, this is Eric speaking, where I'm not in line with radicalism on either side, or extreme far left or extreme far right. But I certainly feel that words have meaning, and sometimes the words you use define who you are, and it puts you into a corner, if you will. Oh, and I think that kind of put you into a corner of where you were, and it was like, well, I put my stake in the ground so far to the right with the radical feminism that they wouldn't let me leave.
Well, it's unfortunate that you think that that's a far right wing perspective. I'm talking about humanity. I'm not talking about, I happen to be a Republican when I ran. I maintain Republican values, and I see eye to eye more with Republicans. That's just the way it is. But I'll tell you this: there's a lot that I would agree with Joe Manchin on out of West Virginia. He's a Democrat, but I don't see this as a political issue at all, Eric. I think that this is it's a humanity issue, and I think it's a societal issue. And frankly, I don't think that anybody should be legislating societal issues. That's left up to the communities. But when you're running in politics, it matters to people. They want to know if you want to maintain, traditional family values. They want to know who they're getting. They want to know who you are. And that was my point, was that, look, my future wife and I, we both agree that we want to maintain, traditional family values. There are expectations on both sides. She has expectations of me, and I have them of her too. So, and that is what you have in a healthy relationship. But you're right. The biting words are important. And I'll say this. I think that in order to be effective, sometimes in a moment of crisis, biting words are effective for very good reason. It's important to have them. And at the time, now you'll notice that there aren't these protests like there were then. If you rewound the clocks back to 2017, you would see it was just it was a mess. And now you're not seeing any pink hat protests. Am I right?
Well, there definitely was a lot of passion on display 2 years ago.
Right. And that's what I was addressing.
So speaking along these lines as well, it sounds like, or it looks like back in November, I want to say it was not last year, but you released a long video defending or supporting Roy Moore. Could you go into that a little bit? Because this kind of touches on those issues.
It certainly does. So with Roy Moore, he was in the public eye for 40 years. He was twice the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court. He was a West Point graduate. He had, I think he has 5 kids, and he's raised them, been married to the same woman, his whole life. here's a man that has, if anybody looked at his resume or his life, they would say, yes, this is a man with a sterling reputation. And then and this is what I believe what happened was when he told Mitch McConnell he wasn't going to, Mitch McConnell's the Senate Majority Leader for the Republican Party. He told Mitch McConnell that he's not going to Washington to work for Mitch. He's going to Washington to represent the state of Alabama. That rubbed Mitch the wrong way. And Roy Moore ended up winning that primary. He beat two very good candidates, Luther Strange and Mo Brooks. And Mo Brooks is somebody that I have enormous respect for. And I would have supported Mo Brooks as much as Roy Moore too. But the fact is that Roy Moore won. Nobody expected him to win. And so when the media did this complete hit job on Roy Moore, all this false nonsense about him, the Republican Party didn't back him up. Interesting, they used the same formula on Brett Kavanaugh, but Mitch McConnell defended Brett Kavanaugh. And so he was able to succeed. Mitch McConnell did not back up Roy Moore because he knew Roy Moore wasn't going to probably play ball with the Republican establishment. Does that make sense?
It certainly does. It kind of leads to why you would support and defend him without necessarily addressing any of the proposed allegations, if you will.
Oh, no, I did. No,
Okay.
I addressed every single one of them. And I even pointed out he had, I think, 7 accusers, but there were 4 primary accusers. The first one was Lee Korfman. And, she said that he had never met Lee Korfman ever in his life. But she came out and said that he had done this horrible thing to her when she was 14 years old. And her story, if you watch the documentary, I go item by item. I line out every single detail of her story and how it doesn't match up. She never worked at the place she said she worked at. She never worked there. Nobody ever remembers her even being there. She said that he served her alcohol at a pizza parlor that has never served alcohol ever. So, the whole story was just completely falling apart. But then what you had was he did date an 18-year-old with the mother's permission, which Roy didn't even have to have. And at the time, Roy was, I think he was in his early 30s. She was 18. He had just, went to war. He served in Vietnam, graduated from West Point, came back, earned his law degree. And so he was an older guy at that point. He was in his early 30s. And he asked the mother's permission. And the 18-year-old, of course, the mother said, yes, we'd be delighted if you dated our daughter. But what they did was they conflated the real stories, the true stories about him dating, and even the 18-year-old, incidentally. This is the one that went on to do sign language for Biden and Hillary. She said that he never did anything inappropriate, he being Roy Moore. She said that he never did anything inappropriate and he never touched her inappropriately. But what the Washington Post did was they conflated the true stories with the fake stories and made him out to be the boogeyman. So I go into great detail on that, and I encourage you, if any of your listeners are interested in that story, I go into great detail explaining all that.
So another question that I have about that video itself, trying to tie in your military experience and your intel analyst, did you use some of your critical thinking and actual fact finding, or just how you put that video together to argue or to defend or support? Absolutely. So when we wrote the outline, the whole thing is sort of framed on building a package, basically. I'm not a lawyer, but I just used the tools that I had, which was intelligence analyst skills. And that's what I used to deliver it. The graphics and all that, of course, I left up to other people. I relied on their judgment, the lighting and all that. I had nothing to do with any of this stuff. But as it relates to laying out and maybe perhaps it should just be written. I don't know that anybody would read it if I just wrote it all out. That's why we made it into a video. But if you did read a transcript of it, no one could read that transcript and walk away thinking that Roy Moore was guilty of anything. I think that any reasonable person would read that transcript and walk away thinking that he's a completely innocent man. Fair enough.
Yeah, okay, yes, I'm big on reason, and maybe this is an intel thing, but we seem to not be able to find enough reasonable people, so maybe reason is too high of a bar. Look, I'm positive I can say this on your guys' behalf. Any reasonable person with any background knows that you can't have top secret anything on any server that's not inside of a SCIF. You can't. And then act like you're going to be a presidential candidate. Like that's multiple felonies right there. Any reasonable person would believe that. Yet, like, it doesn't affect anything. I guess the bigger question I want to ask you, Courtland, is with this experience, with all the stuff you see, the Kavanaugh hearings, and look, wherever anybody lands on the Kavanaugh hearing things, we got past the point of trying to understand if he would be a good justice, and we got into a political fight, and everybody loses at that point because now we didn't really get a chance to assess the man and how he judges things. It became histrionic hyperbole in every direction. Everybody wanted the mic so they could have their 5 minutes. I don't want to be part of that. I don't want to be part of that system. And God bless you if you can, but do you want to sit in front of all that and live in that? I just think I've seen too much hurt and harm and violence in my time from all my combat time. I just don't want to be around all of that. Do you feel a bit of relief or do you think that you're just built to withstand all that nonsense?
No, I'm not relieved at all. And I hate it. And this is one of the reasons I'm passionate about politics, is because it's going to come down to real responsible people jumping in there, being willing to have their heads ripped off in the media because they are honest players. They are honest actors. They're not bought and paid for by the special interests. This issue is bigger than me, Pete. We're talking about the preservation of the United States of America.
Sure.
And so if I am a sacrificial lamb, I never saw myself as that. I never will. I'm not a victim. But if I get chewed up as a result of me trying to do the right thing, so be it. This country is much more important than my life, if that makes sense. And that's why we all got into this business to begin with.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, you get into the political process. It gets a little dirty. Ultimately, you don't win, but you've got a senator that matches, for the most part, what you believe and do. How do you get on board and support him? Have you done anything at all to reach out and say, hey, I'm on board, I want to help? Or how have you done with your relationship with the guy that won?
Well, no, I mean, I'd be happy to, Pete, but frankly, I'm so radioactive in terms of politics that I don't think I'd be a benefit to him or frankly anybody else. And that's fine. That's just, this stuff has a life cycle and it's going to go away eventually. I'm always happy to help, but the focus I've maintained is just a national security. I was the national security candidate. That's what I wanted. That's the reason I was going. And there's so many other things that play into being a senator. I understand that. I can't be a one-trick pony. And I maintain, policies on everything, healthcare, everything you can ask me. But for the most part, just to answer your question, happy to help, but I don't think he doesn't need my help, especially not right now. And he's doing a good job. And I think he's surrounded by a lot of smart people. I know some of the people that sit in on those committees that he's working with, and he's listening to them. So Washington, D.C. is a small town. And so far, he's been very, very responsible. So I leave it up to his judgment.
So that's on the national level. Are you getting involved kind of in the local or the city level at all?
I'd be happy to. I've taken a big break from politics.
Okay.
I still maintain those relationships, though. I mean, I recently went to a birthday party celebrating the 40th birthday party of a friend of ours here, and they're of course involved in local politics, and it's important. And I'll say this: local politics is just as important as national politics. The reason I jumped into the federal level was because that was my wheelhouse. That's what I had experience in. But the state level is very important, and what's going on in our state capitals is very important. I would say just being a member of the school board is incredibly important. So it's just as important. There's a lot of people see, the gold leaf mirrors and the marble halls in Washington, D.C. and say, oh, well, their job, they have so much more responsibility. That's not necessarily true. All politics is local.
Couldn't agree more. Now, I know I'm involved in a lot of local professional organizations. Are you following your service, dedication with any local organizations like American Legion or anything that's in your profession?
So I'm a member of the VFW. Incidentally, the headquarters is based out of Kansas City, Missouri.
That's right.
I have an affiliation with those guys, but my veteran relationships I maintain it's a much more casual atmosphere. To answer your question.
Yeah, I know I'm not quite old enough to become a resident of the VFW Hall.
Come on. Those guys are a lot of fun.
Oh, they certainly are. They certainly are.
Okay, so we're getting close to an hour here, and I want to respect your time and Eric's time as well too. What questions should we have asked you? I mean, there's so many things that I want to ask you about, but what's one question we should have got to that we didn't quite get to?
I think the question as it relates to, there are headlines out there in the media that say Courtland Sykes doesn't believe women should be in the workplace. And we talk about the bad, why I said what I said and why I said these are nasty women, self-proclaimed nasty women. But, what a lot of people don't focus on is, hey, they don't ask me, what is your opinion of a good influence?
Yeah.
Female leadership out there that you've worked with, or maybe that you've been inspired by. And so I never really have an opportunity to really praise all of the good in that regard. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. There's something also to be said too for giving fellas a chance to be on the side of women. Look, I want everybody to have an equal shot. Not everybody has an equal outcome. That happens, but I've actually got a peer-reviewed academic paper that's literally about to release any day now. And it's a feminist paper, but the way it's titled, it's the ethical pitfalls of female empowerment in conflict zones. And before I get yelled at, the person who wants to criticize me, having never read the paper, wants to know, which women are we talking about, and to remind me that all women are empowered. I don't know what words to even use to have a conversation. And so I get where, you can say something that's very fair and good for everybody, and it gets absolutely twisted around and destroyed, and you end up having a defensive conversation instead of one that builds on the greater good. So I appreciate that position, because I've certainly been put in it myself.
Well, I think it's important to look at, I don't know what I haven't read your paper. I'd like to. I think there are a lot of examples out there of good female leadership. Jennifer Matthews, I don't know if that name rings a bell, or if maybe she's even mentioned in your paper, but she was one of the members of the CIA she lost her life over in Afghanistan with that suicide bomb in 2009. And Jennifer Matthews, she was a brilliant lady, very responsible, and she actually was brought on board by Michael Sawyer, who I mentioned earlier. Mm-hmm. Michael Sawyer started the ALEC project, or the ALEC office branch for the CIA. He was head of the Osama bin Laden desk, and they were targeting Al-Qaeda in Africa and Afghanistan in the 90s, which is, really kind of, you guys probably know more about it than I do. But she, for me, is an example of terrific female leadership, and we lost so much just by losing her. We lost so much in terms of national security. And what really struck me was the way that Michael Sawyer talked about her, and he was interviewed because he knew her personally, brought her on board, and she rose through the ranks and became a senior member of that project. But it's really interesting. I actually had Jennifer Matthews died in that conflict, but I actually had a friend that went down, Jeremy Wise, who was in my Buds class 244. Mm-hmm. And he was a guy from Arkansas too. So I think we bonded on that level anyway, but he was actually with her when that suicide bomber detonated his bomb.
Well, listen, we've had you for an hour, and I really appreciate your time. And Eric, I appreciate your time. It's fun to do these things with you guys together.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading your paper. Where can I find it?
Oh, sure. Well, it's going to post in a journal from Sweden, but I'll shoot you a draft copy. The basics of it is that if female empowerment is as important as we believe in a conflict zone, then when we go out and do it, we damn well should be prepared, because it's really hard work, and commanders have to prepare people for combat. And you've worked with SEALs. Mm-hmm. You know how much time they spend on preparing for female empowerment missions? None. Because they have to stay alive. So before we put that weight on a commander's back, understand, what it takes to do those things. That's the big thing. Like, yeah, it's important, but let's treat it like it is and not treat it like it's secondary or tertiary or whatever comes after tertiary in terms of importance on the battlefield.
Well, it really comes down to, if you evaluate success and equality, if you focus on those two things, you'll find talent and gender really will be removed from that equation. All right, gentlemen. Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we'll have you on again.
Take care of Bill Mankins. I want to share my Bill Mankins story with you, if I could sometime, even a sidebar.
Yeah, we'll definitely do that. All right, fellas. Well, thank you so much.